I'd like to introduce everyone to a new idea that we've been forming here at Scorpion Movement, which is that of a podcast. We wanted to talk about some general ideas in philosophy and to delve into these conversations so we can, go over the actual subjects of intricate threads of philosophical thought in a manner that's as relaxed as a serene afternoon conversation. So in this podcast, we're going to be steering away from the natural forms of content that we produce and going forward through reason. So there's no flashy slogans here, just a gentle cadence of discourse and contemplation. If you're the type of person seeking a sanctuary of cerebral reflection, you've found your destination. This entire podcast was Jordan or Murad's idea, so I'll be passing it over to him so he can discuss the general topics he wanted to talk about in this episode.
Yeah, well, I'm Jordan. As Jakub said, this was my idea, so I thought that we'd start off this podcast essentially by providing an introduction to just some of the key philosophical ideas and thinkers that kind of underpin Scorpion Movement as a whole and that have had a big influence on us. I mean, us through here, we have Jakub, myself, Jordan, and the FlyingCabala. We have diverse interests, and our philosophical interests are not completely identical, but there are definitely some common areas of overlap. And specific thinkers that I think have influenced us tremendously. We can talk about Plato, Julius Evola, people like Oswald Spengler, and these various other thinkers that I think are relevant to this critique of modernity that we put forth that's pretty central to our entire movement. So I thought I'll pass it over to FlyingCabala here because he's had a pretty interesting sort of intellectual and philosophical transformation over the years. I mean, you got into Evola at the age of, just a couple of 15. Years ago, I think 2020, I think, right? Because you said that you read Revolting into the Modern World, and then that book just really impacted you. And then that kind of got you into more intellectual pursuits. So if you could expand on that, I think that's a great way to get started here.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So I'll just introduce myself briefly. I'm FlyingCabala. So I would say, interested in traditionalist philosophy as well as Neoplatonic philosophy. Generally speaking, I like to put labels on my own, like Weltanschauung or like worldview. But I would say that at least since a year or two, I have considered myself philosophically to be Neoplatonist. I started with philosophy at a fairly early age, I would say, because I got into right-wing circles when I was about 14 and 15, and through there I was able to discover Julius Evola. So I obtained his work and read it when I was 15 years old, and I would say Julius Evola basically gave me a view into another world. I guess he was kind of the rabbit hole in my life because, when I initially ordered his work and got it, I was expecting, especially judging by the definition and description that Wikipedia gives of him, just be kind of like a right-wing thinker, but his deep thinking actually goes much deeper than that. I'm not saying like he's a perfect thinker, and like that there were no blemishes like involved him, but I would say like he's probably one of the best thinkers of the 20th century, and certainly a deep one, like with a lot of like allusion, reference to tradition.
Discovering Evola led me down so many rabbit holes because I think we've all had a pretty strong interest in politics for sure. For me, it started it actually started really with the 2016 presidential election. I think that was a key watershed kind of moment for all of us because that got me interested in politics. It's just all that everyone was talking about around me. My family members, my friends at school, and then that's when I started to realize, there is this sort of deep division in this country within different political factions. But for a while, I couldn't really conceive of politics as anything beyond this pretty simplistic dichotomy of liberal versus conservative, and do you believe in this amount of government intervention in the economy or Y amount of government intervention in the economy? And it was a very materialistic perspective, and I couldn't really transcend that paradigm. But then discovering thinkers like Evola I mean, just seemed so radical to me at the time. Like, that just opened the door to so much interesting philosophy for me, because he rejected, and I think because I want to talk about third positionist politics here, because, you know, Keith Woods, he made a really interesting video 2 years ago about, you know, the Nazgul vortex. He said, is the Nazgul vortex coming? Is this actually what used to be some fringe, you know, political movement actually rising into the mainstream? And I think it is. And I think the recent developments have made that very clear. And in order to understand those developments, you need to understand Evola, because he rejected not only, you know, liberalism, free market capitalism, but also Marxism, and sort of offered this unique perspective where he says, as long as we're talking about, you know, these materialist concepts, matters of economic relations, class relations, production, GDP, things along those lines, we're so far off from the real issues that, I mean, it's just not even close. And so he
characterized modernity, in other words.
Yeah, you know, that's sort of the defining, some of the defining features of modernity. It's very materialistic worldview. And so when he, you know, when he had these spiritual and ancient mystic and even some occult elements mixed in, I think occultism is pretty important here. That just kind of blew my mind. That's actually what led to me making a presentation on him in philosophy class a couple of years ago. That definitely attracted the interest of the class, because everyone else just kind of picked the most normie philosophers out there. I mean, I have nothing against people like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, but it's obvious that they didn't really have a genuine interest in these thinkers. They just selected them based off of the list that the teacher provided, and so people were kind of just sleeping through the entire class. But I brought up Evola, and we got into, you know, sex, magic, and occultism, and all these out there topics.
Yeah, that's when they really started paying attention.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, just for Gen Z, you know, just say, oh yeah, sex, magic, and, you know, other more extreme topics. But I think some people kind of dismiss, like, if you look up Evola in these, I guess, more normie or mainstream right and left-wing circles, a lot of people dismiss him as this sort of mystic or like fantasist or just strange, like, you know, wizard type figure. But I mean, these topics are still important. I wrote a whole essay on this, actually, about the intersection between occultism and politics, especially far-right reactionary politics. That's the newest video. What's the first video that we actually have in the Scorpion Movement channel. Mm-hmm. Like, we're saying that this intersection is influencing, I mean, world geopolitics. I talked about Alexsandr Dugin in that essay. I definitely want to get to Dugin at some point. But I think, because FlyingCabala, I know that you're very interested in the critiques of the sort of materialist philosophy. I think if we could delve into that, that'd be interesting. Because that is kind of the philosophy, this materialist and, you know, empiricist, sort of atheist worldview does kind of underpin modernity.
Oh yeah,
and I think Platonism, because we mentioned Plato as well, and yeah, Plato was definitely a key influence on Evola. I think Platonism, and especially Platonist metaphysics, can sort of provide an alternative to this. So,
oh yeah, I mean, I think Platonism was an influence on Evola, but probably not like a chief one. But definitely one among them. I mean, he does like cite Plato and Plotinus like throughout his works.
Yeah.
You mentioned like Evola being opposed to Marxism and free market capitalism. To kind of add on to that, in Revolt Against the Modern World, or in another work, not exactly sure, but he basically puts Marxism and capitalism kind of on the same tier. Like, so to speak, like he basically thinks of them as equivalent, because I mean they're both materialistic systems that are like removed from tradition and like they're a divine realm, like, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think, I mean,
there's actually like a in Revolt Against the Modern World, he like also goes into the theory. Like, I mean, I'm assuming most viewers are going to be familiar with the like four-partite caste system of Hinduism. So like they had the Brahmins, and then the warrior caste, then the merchant caste, and the, like, I guess, farmer caste. I guess, like, to basically summarize what he discusses quite a bit in his book, Revolt, he basically sees like the history of modernity as like power being passed like to those classes. So like he thinks that during the Golden Age, like power was held by the Brahmins, and then the Silver Age, power was like held by the warrior caste. So like Alexander the Great, for instance, like military chiefs, like so to speak, being in charge of power. And then like with free market capitalism, so like from about like the 17th century on to hitherto, like we have the like merchant class kind of in charge of power. And they control like, all the financial organs of government. Then he sees Marxism as basically the lowest caste, like the working in subsequently, I guess, dirtiest class. Yeah, taking control of power, because I mean Marxism is ultimately like egalitarian and focused on the working class. So I guess he kind of sees Marxism as the end of history.
And I think, which is actually funny because there's this prominent liberal thinker in international relations named Francis Fukuyama, who also has this book called The End of History. He's coming at it from the complete opposite perspective of Evola. And I'm actually in the process of writing an essay where I essentially refute the thesis that Fukuyama puts forth in that book. But I wanted to bring that up because in The End of History, Fukuyama states essentially that, look, now that the Cold War is over and the Soviet Union has collapsed, we're entering the reign where liberal democracy is pretty much entrenched as the political system worldwide. It is the dominant system, the sort of liberal capitalist hegemony, and it's not going away anytime soon. And because of this, this ties into something called Golden Arches theory, which essentially states, it's in reference to this idea that the two countries with McDonald's will not go to war with each other, but it states, liberal capitalist democracies are generally more peaceful and they don't go to war with each other, they don't invade each other. So I think it's kind of a naive concept. But the reason I bring up Fukuyama is because I think Evola kind of has the complete, opposite stance on it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and because you talked about this cyclical conception of history, right, and the ideas that he borrowed from Hinduism. Well, what he borrowed from Hinduism, which I think most people, this term is actually becoming much more popular recently, is the idea that we live in the Kali Yuga, which in Hinduism is the Dark Age. And it's this period of spiritual, cultural, metaphysical sort of degradation and decay. And so I think what he says is we're actually going to be seeing a lot more sort of violence and chaos.
As you all don't mind, I could very quickly interject. I'm actually very familiar with Fukuyama's notion just because his concepts were put in the foreword of the introduction of Capitalism Realism by Mark Fisher. And as much as I don't fully agree with those concepts, I don't think they're incompatible with Evola's thought, because other than the fact that they are semi on opposite sides of the philosophical and political spectrum, the notion that the world ended around 9/11 or the passing into the 21st century with liberal capitalism being instilled everywhere and all possible historical events already happening and becoming highlighted through forms of mass media, I think that's a very I need to find the word, anti-materialist notion. There we go. That's what I was going for. The idea that everything that could happen in the course of human progress towards liberal democracy, whether liberal democracy is something that we are for or in our case against, that's the idea that maybe for some people of overall stagnation, for some people of growth. Right? So if you're a pro-liberal democracy, you would think that we have accelerated towards this point and this is the final ultimatum of history. Whereas if you're against liberal democracy, like Evola would seem to be, and indeed was, you arrive at this point where you think to yourself, okay, well, we have officially entered the Dark Age because we have descended so far towards materialism, as Fukuyama points out, right?
Yeah, that's actually a good point. With liberal hegemony being so entrenched, that would fit in with the Evolan conception of the Dark Age.
Yeah, so I found a way to integrate the two. I think if
And it's
Evola, if a thinker like Evola was alive today, he would probably come to a similar conclusion that Fukuyama did, that the world has like come to a grinding halt, where no significant events are made anymore because everything seems to be in a sort of standstill. We are at a post-Cold War period that is numb. The political, the geopolitical landscape is numb. That's all there is to it.
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned Mark Fisher, because he actually has had a big influence on me as well, especially his book Capitalist Realism, but also his writings on, music and cultural criticism and subjects like that. And I generally see him classified as a Marxist, right? I mean, I think he's considered himself to be a Marxist, which on its face that shouldn't really be compatible with Evola's thought, but I actually do see I see a certain level of compatibility though, especially in the which you mentioned with this concept of the Kali Yuga, but also in his criticism that he offers of capitalism in that book, Capitalist Realism, and specifically its effects on culture. I mean, because what he says is that it's sort of leading to this cultural stagnation.
Yeah, that's
right?
the funny thing, though. The far right and the far left, the philosophical far right and far left, the extremist factions seem to share an overall hatred of materialism. They just express it in completely different ways.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, Mark Fisher states that we're seeing this, sort of cultural stagnation as a result of capitalism, actually. And
by the way, sorry to
about this little bit of planned obsolescence and concepts like that. But
sorry to interrupt a little bit, but when you use the word materialism, like, do you refer to metaphysical materialism or like socio, geopolitical?
Cultural. That's what I was aiming for. It's consumerism. Another word for it.
Oh, okay, I understand.
Yeah.
I mean, well, I think that they're actually somewhat related, and that's why I think that's where I think Platonism comes in, because
I think we could actually jump in.
Yeah, and the materialist and materialism and the metaphysical usage, as I understand, basically suggests that the only thing that really exists is the material world, these material physical objects. And as a logical extension of that line of thought, it's kind of the only thing that really matters. But I think the problem with that, in Platonism, I actually see Platonism as sort of and I wonder what you guys think of this. I see it as basically I see Platonist metaphysics as
the opposite.
I see third positionist political ideology as basically political mirror of Platonist metaphysics, right? Because what Platonism suggests, and FlyingCabala, you can definitely expand on this, is that, okay, there's basically this realm that exists beyond not only the material world, what we see around us, but also beyond our internal world, right, our inner thoughts. And it's this world where, in philosophy, we'd call them transcendentals. It's where these transcendentals and sort of abstract conceptions exist, right? Ideas like love, symmetry, aesthetics, form, right? Telos, which in philosophy is just purpose. And I think Dugin, because we mentioned Dugin, he actually comes to a similar conclusion in his book Political Platonism, where he says that, he founded a National Bolshevik Party in Russia with Edward Limonov, probably one of the most well-known, third positionist or Nazbol parties. And he says that Plato is actually a huge influence on the ideology of that party, because like third position, when you look into this third realm, what that suggests is that, there is this sort of higher purpose that kind of transcends the material world, right? And in third positionist politics, you come to a similar conclusion, because think about what third positions kind of strive for. It's not, let's maximize our GDP or our economic productivity or things like that. It's no, we need loyalty to some more abstract transcendental quality, things like the nation, right? Our people, our ethnicity. I mean, sometimes third positionism is actually it can be a multi-ethnic unit. We see that with the Syrian Social Nationalist Party in the Levant. I would classify them as a third positionist party, but adherence or devotion to some greater ideal, which I think is kind of similar to Platonist metaphysics, right? Because in the modern worldview, Dugin says that the West moving away from Platonist metaphysics was kind of one of the greatest tragedies pretty much in history, because now what we're left with is I think if you take the materialist worldview to its logical conclusion, and this is kind of the foundation of most people's worldviews nowadays, whether or not they sort of even realize that, then you're left with this very hedonistic kind of libertarian approach to life, where, okay, well, if all that's real is the material world, and these transcendental or abstract conceptions don't really matter, or they don't have any grounding in empiricism, so therefore they're invalid, then what should I do? Well, I should maximize my pleasure in this material world, right? And so that leaves us with this very hedonistic approach. I call it Neo-Epicureanism, because it's like the thought of Epicurus, but just amplified to an extreme level, beyond what I think even he would have agreed with. And so, yeah, in the modern worldview, because of this, we're left with this, most people are left with this teleological worldview. No, there's no sense of a higher purpose. They just maximize their pleasure, and that's why we have these phenomenons like, Coomers and soy boys and all these, this sort of meme lingo, these people that just live these pathetic kind of degenerate lifestyles. I know that was a very kind of rambly monologue there, but FlyingCabala, I think you want to expand on this.
Oh yeah, I'll definitely. So yeah, it's like Plato and certainly his followers, that modern scholarship labels as the Neoplatonists, emphasize in his works the immaterial. So Platonists actually assume that what is becoming not only is like naturally inferior to being, but is less real than being. Well, because being is, but then becoming becomes. So in other words, like they discuss the, so to speak, realm of the forms, which later Neoplatonist thinkers would label as nous. And nous in ancient Greek means, I guess it's a very controversial term because modern scholars kind of, or I guess a lot of Neoplatonists don't really like to translate it because translating it into English kind of removes a lot of nuance from it. But usually it's translated as intellect. Because it's kind of the divine intellect that holds, like, so to speak, the forms that are outside of space, outside of matter, outside of time. And ultimately, I think that's pretty much the basis of Neoplatonic metaphysics, or just Platonist metaphysics, is that there's the world or realm of being, that it is like naturally outside of becoming, in which like there's no becoming, and like if one is able to ultimately contemplate that world, one would attain ultimate bliss. So I mean, I always like to say that Plato has an esoteric dimension that like modern scholarship almost never.
Yeah, that's true. Especially the sort of the narrative that you get about Plato in mainstream education. I mean, if you take a philosophy class or a world history class in high school, they might touch on Plato, but it's never really they're not going to touch what we just talked about. They never really go beyond things like allegory of the cave, or maybe
the allegory of the cave is a very good example because
maybe
it begins with.
Okay, I'd like to ask a question. To what extent do you guys think that Christianity is compatible with Neoplatonism, in terms of like Augustine of Hippo and early Christian philosophy?
I was actually going to segue into that topic because I saw this. I saw E. Michael Jones, who's this Catholic apologist, recently say he's pretty popular. Now he said, he criticized Orthodox Christianity. And he said, this is just Neoplatonism. It's the same thing, which sparked a lot of controversy. I mean, I certainly see some similarities, and I wanted to talk about Gnosticism as well, actually.
Oh yeah,
because I think it's very relevant. But I think FlyingCabala, seems like you want to.
Oh yeah. So I'll first touch on Gnosticism because I think it's very germane, and then I'll actually segue into the question of how compatible Neoplatonism is with Christianity. So Gnosticism, I would say, is kind of a loose term of Christian movements, like kind of from the first few centuries. From like the first few hundreds. so to speak, because there wasn't necessarily a canonized form of Christianity at that time. That's why you had like a lot of movements like within Christianity that like considered themselves Christians, but they weren't necessarily tied in a common canon, I would say. So like that's why you had the Arians, like Arians, and Gnostics, and a bunch of other movements. So the Gnostics ultimately saw the material world, generally speaking, created by an evil, like a quote-unquote evil demiurge, and they called him Yaldabaoth. But then beyond the material realm created by the, like, so to speak, ignorant/malevolent Yaldabaoth, there's the realm of bliss and purity and being. So I guess compatible with the Neoplatonic understanding of being. But then they see Jesus Christ as basically the human being that got incarnated onto Earth to basically remove humanity from its ignorance, and to basically like take humanity to the upper like realm, like above Yaldabaoth.
To the divine realm, sort of.
Yeah, exactly. So,
I do think that there was some tension though between Neoplatonism and Gnosticism. I mean, as far as I'm aware, Plotinus, who's kind of, I guess you could call him the father of Neoplatonism. He's definitely in that school. He wrote an essay or some work criticizing Gnosticism.
I have actually read that work.
Yeah, so there is some tension, but I definitely see some key similarities, especially with this idea of this sort of flawed or evil material world, and the notion of gnosis, right? I think that that kind of what does gnosis exactly mean in what is it, Greek, or because it's
knowledge? Yeah.
So
in Greek, it's actually an interesting concept because when it comes to languages, not all words translate exactly. So in Greek, there are actually 3 words that can be like roughly translated as knowledge. So doxa, episteme, and gnosis. And I would say like one can probably like arrange them hierarchically. So doxa would be, well, I guess a more common translation would be opinion. So that's basically just I guess the opinion of the rabble, like so to speak.
Yes.
Or just the belief, like so to speak. So that's the lowest form of knowledge. Then episteme, that means like understanding, because like episteme in ancient Greek, like that's the verb for to understand. So that's the one that is like above that. So like it means just understanding something. But I guess it just generally speaking refers to secular knowledge, or like I don't know, knowledge about history, or something like that. But then gnosis is the highest type of knowledge, and it's a spiritual type. So
yes,
when the Gnostics use it, they like refer to mean spiritual knowledge that can basically take you up to the divine like realms. And I mean, I would say like I don't think Neoplatonists use that word too much, but I mean, if you like, I think the meaning of it is quite understandable. I mean, basically, in other words, just spiritual knowledge, or the highest type, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think also what sort of differentiated Gnosticism from later Christian sects is that they didn't really prioritize this dichotomy between sin and repentance, which is kind of what most people associate with Christianity, but rather with illusion, as in sort of not being able to escape the confines of this flawed material world and enlightenment, or what you described as gnosis. So it's just basically getting divine or esoteric insight. So it's a very mystical concept. Yeah, and I think that's why, because we touched on occultism earlier, and occultism and esotericism, and how Plato kind of laid the groundwork for that in a sense. I mean, Gnosticism is definitely very interconnected to occultism. I mean, so many occult sects were inspired by it. Like, you can go up to Aleister Crowley, this is who founded the Church of Thelema, right? I mean, fascinating figure.
Yeah.
And that was kind of that was actually sort of the basis for his various ideas of ritual magic and sex magic and divination, trying to escape this material.
Like, to be honest, like, it's starting to sorry to interrupt, but I don't think Crowley was a very serious figure. Like from what I know about him, I think they're just more serious, like occult figures than him, because he does place a lot of emphasis on sex, magic.
Yeah, I think
it's might be pretty fishy as to why. As to if he actually thought that to be conducive to spirituality, or if he just kind of exploited people for his own perversion.
Yeah, no, there's absolutely no doubt that he was a bit of a sexual pervert.
Yeah, exactly.
He had all these bizarre sodomy rituals and everything. But we mentioned.
So yeah,
we mentioned.
I definitely wouldn't put him.
But Evola definitely had an interest in sex magic as well, and these more obscure concepts. He wrote a book called the Eros.
Yeah, you're right.
Sex, where he lays it all, and I think he actually did. He in one of his books, I'm not sure if it was Eros or some other books, he actually writes about Aleister Crowley, and people draw many similarities between Crowley and Evola to the point where I've even seen some detractors of Evola say that he was a wannabe Aleister Crowley. They both had many very similar and kind of niche obsessions, like mountain climbing, right? Aleister Crowley was actually a champion mountaineer, and then Evola actually wrote a book called Meditations on the Peaks, where he argues. Mountain climbing is one of the ultimate means of self-actualization and reaching this sort of transcendental state. So I wouldn't really. I see people do kind of tend to dismiss Crowley as just this strange sort of drug addicted edgelord type. I wouldn't completely dismiss him entirely, because his ideas have definitely had influence, and he was actually connected to some very powerful elite figures. We tend to associate these ideas of occult satanic elites practicing strange rituals as just outlandish or bizarre, just the realm of these schizo conspiracy theories. But when you actually start diving into these topics, and I've done a lot of research on things like parapolitics over the years, you see it's not really as far-fetched from reality as you might think. Aleister Crowley actually had ties to British intelligence. He worked for the MI5, and he was active in all of these covert operations. He had a role in the sinking of the Lusitania, the flight of Rudolf Hess, who was this famous Nazi leader. Not leader, but, Nazi figure. And he actually was connected to the founding of NASA's Jet Propulsion's laboratory, which was founded by this guy, Jack Parsons, who was also a Thelemite occultist, and they had anal sex rituals in the desert in California.
I think we should get more into Jack Parsons while we're at it for a little bit.
Oh, yeah, Jack Parsons. FlyingCabala, have you heard of Jack Parsons, this figure?
I might have.
He's kind of one of my go-to historical figures when you just want to sort of delve into the more bizarre side of things, because the origins of NASA are very strange. But yeah, he was he pretty much laid the groundwork for rocket science as a field of study as we know it. Before his developments, it was sort of just viewed as something confined to the pages of sci-fi novels, and it wasn't really taken seriously by the mainstream scientific world. But he was a brilliant man, and so he sort of pioneered this rocket science technology and the concept of sending rockets into the moon. So he became a scientist at Caltech. His formal background was in chemistry, and he had this huge lab in Pasadena. But it was also there in California that he met Aleister Crowley, and he actually joined this lodge. He joined this called the Ordo Templo Orientalis. And so he became very obsessed with these ideas of sex magic and black magic, magical rituals. He was a very disturbed person. When he was a child, he tried to summon the devil in his bedroom. I think he was in middle school at the time. But he was engaging in his rituals, and he basically viewed NASA's the rockets that he'd be designing for NASA as weapons that would be penetrating the dome of God. The dome of God. He viewed the heavens as the dome of God, like literal satanic projectiles. And before he would test out his rockets, he would actually chant hymns to this pagan god Pan. And it all sort of culminated in this ritual in the desert in California that's now known as the Babalon Working. And it's absolutely absurd. anal sex with Aleister Crowley and ate cakes made out of semen and other bizarre rituals because they believed that they would summon this deity. I think it would summon, what is it? The Whore of Babylon, they called it, which is some figure in Christianity, actually. Whore of Babylon. And there was the Whore of Babylon is related to Gnosticism in some way. I mean, there's a lot of strange iconography in Gnosticism. Just some of it escapes me. I can't really recite it off the top of my head, but I mean, he's pretty much the go-to example of sort of occult or mystical beliefs actually having an influence on world events and world history. And I mean, it's just kind of fascinating to realize that the motivations for the creation of rocket science and NASA's jet propulsion laboratory were just so bizarre and out there. Which kind of ties into what we've been talking about throughout this podcast, like with Alexsandr Dugin. I definitely want to talk about him as well. But yeah, that's the bizarre life of Jack Parsons. And there's actually a good book on that. It's called Sex and Rockets. It's published by Feral House, which I'm actually making my next YouTube video is going to be sort of analysis of Feral House and some of the work that they do. They're just a publishing press that was founded by Adam Parfrey. And the book that I'm writing right now actually is something that I aim to get published by Feral House. They're still around, but they cover a lot of material like this. In addition to philosophy as well, they actually published Meditations on the Peaks by Evola, or at least in English translation in the 1990s. But yeah, so bizarre stuff.
Well, actually, I mean, the copy that I have is published by Inner Traditions, so like that's
Traditions. Inner Traditions also published it, but there are multiple editions. It's very hard to find the Feral House one. I don't know. I don't even know. They don't even sell it on their website, but it was published by them at one point in the 94, I think. Yeah, but I mean, I think we should just jump into talking about Dugin, honestly, because he's a name that just keeps getting brought up more and more frequently. It seems, and he definitely has very direct.
Well, frankly, I mean, I think we kind of went a little bit off the rails because I mean, Jakub did ask the question like Neoplatonism, how compatible it is with Christianity. I don't really want to leave that.
I did, and eventually we ended up at Rockets.
And Jack Parsons. I mean, it's just such a fascinating story, but yeah, we did kind of go off the rails.
So let me actually give more of a synopsis what Neoplatonism is, and then I'll address the question of compatibility with Christianity, because I mean I think Neoplatonism certainly has had quite a bit of influence, let's say, on Christianity, but particularly I think both Catholicism, like Saint Augustine, there was certainly quite a bit of he's probably one of the influenced figures by Neoplatonism, because I mean if I'm not wrong, he actually learned that God was not presence or not a material present being, but an immaterial present being, from Plotinus. So in other words, he learned that God has an immaterial presence from Plotinus. I believe when he was about 17 or 18 years old, when he was reading the Enneads, the works written by Plotinus. So I would say Neoplatonism is basically a follow-up of Plato's esoteric ideas that were essentially brought out into the public by named Plotinus. Initially, he wasn't really into philosophy until at the age of 28 he met a man called Ammonius Saccas. Not really much is known about that guy. There was a schizo on YouTube, a kind of schizo guy that made a 15-minute video trying to analyze his name, and he somehow got to the result that means Scythian sage, but I don't understand his reasoning. But anyways, he was kind of the esoteric teacher that he met, that I assume exposed him to the esoteric side of Plato, and ultimately he was introduced to philosophy and started to publish a lot of texts in Greek, like regarding Greek philosophy, like regarding Platonic philosophy, particularly, like expanding on it. In total, he wrote about, so like it's 9 times 6, so it's 54 tractates during his life. So the reason as to why this main work, the Enneads, is called Enneads is because it comes from the Greek word ennea, which means 9. It's like they're split into like 9 pieces, times 6 in total. So basically, it analyzes. I mean, it's a huge spiritual tradition. Many books have been written about it. Well, I wouldn't say too many, but obviously, like I don't want this to be the main subject of this podcast. I think we have already discussed like the main tenets of it.
Or monism, I'd say, is probably one of the key things.
I'm sorry?
Right? Monism, or is it monism?
Oh, yeah, monism.
Key doctrines.
And then emanation, particularly.
Yeah.
So,
all of reality.
from the highest principle, so the one, onto nous, and then to the like world soul, and then onto matter. So what's the good, like in particular, the one being the most good, like the most timeless, the most eternal.
Yes.
Principle. In other words, the monad, the good. In Greek, it's to agathon. So what really means the good.
I mean, I see that Neoplatonist idea of monism as actually having influence on perennial philosophy.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, because perennial philosophy basically, it's quite an interesting perspective. You don't really hear it talked about too often in your basic philosophy classes, but it says all of these, sort of ancient philosophies and mystical ideas kind of originate from one common esoteric metaphysical truth or origin, essentially. And so it sort of reconciles these different sects and religions and philosophies. And I think it's pretty relevant here because one of Evola's key influences, to me, when we talk about Evola's intellectual development, I always bring up Oswald Spengler, who I think is an incredibly, a very relevant and pertinent figure, because he wrote he wrote a book called Decline of the West, and it had 2 editions. Yeah. One was published in 1918 and then the other in 22. And he said that, human societies and civilizations are akin to basically biological organisms or entities. And like any biological organism, that means that they have finite lifespans, right? And so that's where he introduces, and because any organism's lifespan can generally be divided into cycles, right? Youth, adulthood, adolescence is one cycle. He said history and human civilizations undergo the same cyclical transformations. And as you can tell from the title of the book, Decline of the West, he thought, we're in the era of Western civilization, there was this sort of decline, this degradation, that it would actually culminate in this sort of violent collapse, right? Because every organism eventually dies, and that marks, the collapse of the cycle. But I see, that Spengler was a key influence on Evola. What I see in Evola and in books like Revolt Against the Modern World is basically blending the Spenglerian conception of history with slightly more mystical ideas derived from Hinduism, but especially from René Guénon. René Guénon, I see, is a really important, I see as a really important figure. I think Spengler would gain on some Hindu ideas, and Guénon is definitely one of the kind of the 3 big, one of the key figures in the big 3 of perennialism. There's also, some people even regard Evola as a perennialist, but there's obviously some debate about that. But I think the big 3 of perennialism is like Guénon, Kumaraswamy, and then one other thinker whose name escapes me at the moment. Yeah,
Frithjof Schuon.
Yeah, Schuon. And what's interesting is, Evola, he did criticize Christianity quite strongly, but I do see him as having a certain fondness for, look, if you look at his books, he was a master of comparative religions. He drew from Hinduism, from Islam, from ancient Greek philosophy. There's definitely, pretty compatible with perennialism, but they both wrote a lot about Islam, right? René Guénon actually he converted to Sufism in Cairo, Egypt, and there's a lot of
he also changed his name to Arabic.
Yeah, to Sheikh Abdul Wahid, I believe. Yeah, But there's a lot of muddy ground when it comes to the relationship between, like the dissident right and third positions to Islam. Like a lot of people are stuck in this sort of boomer mindset where they think that, like the right is Islamophobic, or they just want to keep all the Muslims out, keep all the third worlders out. I think it goes a little bit deeper than that, and this is where perennialism comes into play, and this is why it's such an important philosophy nowadays. In the Metaphysics of War, which is definitely a book that I really wanted to touch on, it's one of Evola's deeper cuts. Well, I mean, the basic sort of theme of that book is that Evola views war, violence, and combat as actually positive forces, and he views them as means of self-actualization and transcendence for the individual, especially amidst a world that he sees as very spiritually desiccated and and kind of emasculated, right? That's how he characterizes this modern world, the Kali Yuga, and that ties into Guénon because, well, actually, FlyingCabala, if you wanted to expand on this a bit, because you probably know more about Guénon than I do.
Let's see. So, like, if I was to start with Guénon, I guess I would just give like a brief biographical account of him. So, like, he was basically a French philosopher, like born around, like, I think it's one of the areas in Paris. Like in his early youth, he was involved in a lot of occult movements. So, like,
I believe he was a Freemason at one point, right? He established a Freemasonic lodge.
Yeah. By occult, I don't necessarily mean like just the really bizarre stuff like Crowley. Like Crowlerian stuff. But just like kind of the more esoteric sects that existed in France at the time. Eventually, like, he got into the study of Hindu doctrines. Like, he did establish some connections with other like people who have like allegedly traveled to the Far East. Like, I think he was like in touch with a guy that like traveled to Vietnam, because Vietnam back then was a French colony, and like I think might have gotten initiated into some sort of like esoteric sect, like of some sort. So ultimately speaking, like, he became kind of a mouthpiece for like Eastern traditions, like particularly for Hinduism. And eventually, like, he ended up moving to Egypt, where like he converted to Sufism, as you said, changed his name, got married, like had kids, and like published a bunch of books on like traditionalism. I actually have like a bunch of them right over here on the book.
He wrote Crisis of the Modern World, right? I believe that was in the 1920s.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure that Evola got influence from that when he named his
So
book.
he was a very huge influence on Evola. Like, I think if I was to go through the revolt against the modern world, he probably cites Guénon on like every other page.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, sorry, earlier I kind of lost.
So actually, I think when he was a teacher, like Guénon, or like a professor, I think Evola might have actually attended his classes.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, sorry, earlier I kind of lost my train of thought because there's some weird noise right outside my house, but it was nothing. So what I was really sort of trying to lead into is, just appraisal that Evola delivers of war and violence and metaphysics of war, but he dives into these different ideas surrounding war in ancient religions and philosophies, and when he gets to Islam, I think he actually does praise the concept of jihad. Of jihad, actually, on a spiritual level as well. He views this as one of the important manifestations of like the war drive, basically, or the drive for violence. And I think that's really relevant because we've seen such a transformation in the dissident right over the years. I mean, I think it's just really obvious. Like, if you go back to and this is to sort of ground the conversation in to a more pragmatic level. I think if you go back to 2016, the milieu on the dissident right was essentially, this kind of like boomer, almost not quite neocon, but very civic nationalist perspective that actually said, MAGA, like, we're Christian above all else. Sort of very. I don't like the term Islamophobic because of what it's been turned into, but just very anti-Islam and promoting Judeo-Christian values, which, as we know, is kind of a farce now, because there are obviously key distinctions between Judaism and Christianity and their values. But there's been a big transformation where now the right is actually a lot more accepting of Islam, I think. And you're seeing that, for example, in more recent times, last year with Andrew Tate. Now, it's interesting to bring someone like Andrew Tate into this conversation. You probably wouldn't expect it at first, but I think his conversion to Islam in the last year actually had a really big impact on the right, and especially the right among Generation Z, because that actually because of how prominent of a figure he was and how you just could not escape his name last year. His conversion to Islam actually inspired a lot of young people, a lot of Zoomers, to sort of look into these more traditional ideas. Like if you go on social media in 2023, if go on Instagram or Twitter, you're gonna see all these trad pages, Trad West, all these pages that extol the virtues of a traditional lifestyle and family, motherland, fraternity, all of these ideas. And so I think now, because people are just so sort of discontent and dissatisfied with the modern world, with this, just like OnlyFans and Coomers and Pornhub and all this sort of degeneracy running amok, they're actually looking to these earlier, ancient, not just ancient, but these earlier, even more mystical traditions in order to find some meaning. And so now we're actually seeing that Islam is more accepted, right? I mean, like look at Sneeko. If you want to talk about really popular figures that are influencing Generation Z, he converted to Islam recently, and that sort of had a domino effect. And that's why I think perennialism is just such an important philosophy. Like if you talked about this 20, and it's very relevant to our time, 2020s. Like if you talked about this 20 years ago, the idea that there could sort of be this reconciliation between Christianity and Islam and these different religions among the right, especially the far right, would have just seemed bizarre. I mean, we were in the early stages of the war on terror, and there was this very, civic nationalist, we got to get those muzzies, kill those Muslims kind of push. But there's just been such a transformation, and it's so interesting. I mean, what have you guys noticed in terms of like ideological transformations? Because what I see is actually a lot more skepticism of capitalism. Like these thinkers are kind of, even these people like Lawrence Southern are actually moving to the perennialist, even third positionist tradition that we've been talking about for an hour right now. Like Lawrence Southern recently made a video that was called A Critique of Capitalism from a Conservative Perspective. So it's just been such an interesting transformation. So I was just wondering what you guys think of this and, its relation to perennialism, third positionism, etc.
I mean, I do think that Evola, like Guénon, and like people like Gin, to them certainly have like at least some influence on like, the modern right. Probably like not an extreme extent, like to the point that like a lot of people actually base like a lot of like groypers base their ideology on them, but I think there are definitely some ideas that are in common. But I mean, I think among the right, Islam has I think become more tolerant, like so to speak, maybe because I mean, Muslims are generally speaking like more opposed to like stuff that like the modern like neoliberal order promotes, like
yes, exactly,
like gay, like cooming stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. Which again, I mean, that as we mentioned earlier, if you want to be more abstract about it, that sort of is just like the logical conclusion of the materialist worldview. Sort of this hedonistic pursuits, right? Because if there was like a sort of, if you had a telos or some greater transcendental purpose, right, then you would actually be far more willing to undergo.
Oh, sorry, are you saying
or telos? Yeah, I mean it's pronounced. Yeah. I think the pronunciations are basically interchangeable.
Okay,
right?
Okay.
Yeah, just if you had this, telos or transcendental purpose, you would be far more willing to forsake some of these, short-term pleasures.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Which, and you'd be more willing to pursue delayed gratification, which also ties into the message of self-improvement that is pretty core to Scorpion movement. So
yeah. So ultimately speaking, I would say that Yeah, I think there is growing and there's like dissatisfaction like with the neoliberal order. So like a lot. I mean, I think young people are seeing like a lot of degeneracy, really, like or moral decadence, or just like lack of meaning, I would say, in life. And I guess Islam is like an outlet for them. So like I think that could be an explanation as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, this is the crisis of our times, and it doesn't really get that much attention in the mainstream, but I mean, that's why we're here to cover these types of issues. So, and actually Spengler, because I mentioned Oswald Spengler, he essentially predicted this in Decline of the West more than 100 years ago. He said, what he said in that book is that at some point in Western civilization, this like sort of materialist corporate hegemony, right, would actually come to an end. And instead of capitalism being the predominant system, we'd actually see a return to older forms of hierarchy, where there'll be value placed upon just strong, the most fit in society. It's called the new man in Spenglerian philosophy. So it's just kind of similar to Nietzsche as well.
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
I mean, it's also this idea of Nietzsche and idea of the Übermensch. And definitely has some similarities with Evola, specifically what he borrowed from Hinduism, right? About these different castes and the golden age of when, the warrior class kind of ruled over society. And we had this more hierarchical model versus what he views as when modernity being ruled by, basically the bugmen. He did not call them the bugmen, but sort of the lower castes. The lower castes that are very far from this aristocratic warrior status. So it's just interesting to see events unfold, and it's kind of all of these ancient ideas are just kind of they're coming to fruition, like they're unfolding before our eyes. So these types of thinkers, like a lot of people say, why do you even care about something like esoteric? Well, I don't like to say esoteric Hitlerism, because that's more so associated with people like Miguel Serrano, who did kind of go off the rails. I mean, he met with Evola and they were associates, but he gets us to some very sort of wacky territory with things like Hollow Earth and, UFOs. But, there is, a lot of this, in mainstream academia, these types of subjects and thinkers aren't really covered that extensively.
Yeah, exactly.
And so we're seeing that they're actually they have written some of the most important works in order to understand the condition of the modern world.
Yeah.
And they're still relevant more than 100 years later, which is why I think it's so important that we cover these thinkers. I actually, on my YouTube channel, I have a couple more videos coming out soon, and one of them that I'm working on is going to be called The Life and Philosophy of Julius Evola. It's based on this PowerPoint presentation that I had mentioned earlier in the podcast that I made for my philosophy class, but now that I have more knowledge on the topic, I can obviously draw connections to all these different figures. So you can subscribe to my channel if you're interested in content like that. It's just Jordan's Archive. But yeah.
So we were talking about like the relevancy of those thinkers, like that you mentioned. Yeah, exactly. No, I definitely agree. I guess a lot of the other like quote unquote thinkers that like are popular in pop culture today.
Yes.
Like, what's his name? Like Tyson or something like that. Like he's like that black guy.
Which there are many black guys. Wait, Sneeko?
No, like that. What's his name? Like Neil deGrasse.
Neil deGrasse.
Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah,
Neil deGrasse Tyson is like a Reddit tier atheist guy, though. He doesn't.
I mean, I guess
he's never had that many. He's never had that much insight to provide, in my view. But
no, exactly. That's what I mean. So, like, I mean, a lot of the quote unquote thinkers that like are popular.
Exactly.
I think don't like necessarily give a good picture of like the status quo and like what actually led to
modernity. I mean, it's funny that you bring up. It's actually funny that you bring up Neil deGrasse Tyson, because he's the king of scientism, I call it, which is basically and philosophy of science is essentially like the fetishization of science. And he actually said once, he's made numerous statements, like this public statements. He said in an interview, he was asked what are his thoughts on philosophy. And as a scientist, what advice would he give to people that are pursuing philosophy? And instead of being sort of, of offering any advice, he actually went the other direction. He said, oh no, don't pursue philosophy. Like, he literally said that. He said, don't pursue philosophy. For some reason, he described it as a dark path. He said it's going to send you in the wrong direction. He said that stuff is crazy, it's evil, or just don't pursue it. He said metaphysics is garbage. And so
basically just take the blue pill. Like.
Yeah. Yeah, no, literally just take the blue pill. I mean, so he said it himself. Like, the king of Reddit atheism, the king of scientism, literally said, don't watch Scorpion Movement type content.
Yeah.
It's just funny that you bring him up, because that's kind of the first thing that came to mind when I think of Neil deGrasse Tyson. And that's the problem. Like, a lot of I used to be really big into the new atheist movement, right? The four horsemen of new atheism: Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett. When I was in middle school, because I've always had a more rebellious, sort of contrarian disposition, and I was brought up in a Presbyterian school and an elementary school, so I was naturally attracted to that type of thinking. But I read God Is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, and I used to consider him my hero, but to be honest, I wasn't really that impressed with the book. Even when I was 13 and I was a pretty fervent atheist at the time, I still wasn't impressed with the arguments that were made in the book, because he was basically just cherry picking select examples of religious groups that have committed atrocities, it's not like, when you look at the new atheists, they show that they don't have any knowledge of metaphysics or any of the topics that we talk about, right? That we've talked about in this podcast. So they have to resort to these very weak, cherry-picked examples of moral outrage. They never actually attack any metaphysical foundations, right?
Exactly.
And then from then on, what I realized is, even though these new atheist thinkers are supposed to be the most rebellious, provocateurs and mavericks, they all kind of lead you down this normie path, and they never really have anything to offer beyond that. Like, you have the example of Neil deGrasse Tyson. I think Bill Nye, who's probably even more pathetic. He's a pop scientist. He actually says he made similar comments about philosophy, and I think a shared problem with their worldview is that it presupposes empiricism as its epistemological foundation, and it basically says that the only way, and this is how they debunk the debunkers, right? This is how they debunk all these ancient ideas. They say, oh, well, none of this can be proven through empirical evidence, right? They basically assume that empiricism, or which is actually in the history of philosophy called naive empiricism, that's what this concept is referred to as. They say empiricism is the only foundation that we have for acquiring and attaining knowledge, right? And anything that falls out of the purview of sensei is just sort of invalid. That's what they always said. Do you have any empirical evidence for this? But if you think more deeply about that, you realize that, well, the problem is that the notion itself that empiricism is the main valid way of attaining knowledge can actually be proven through empirical means itself. So therefore, at a fundamental level, it's quite self-contradictory to the point where it can't even get off the ground. And I think that when I realized that sort of made me question everything, and I did a complete 180 in terms of my philosophical views.
Actually, so can you talk a little bit more as to how, like, you were saying that empiricism can be, like, dismantled through empirical means?
When I'm saying I don't necessarily think that it can be dismantled, but I do think at a certain level this notion of the naive empiricism is self-contradictory, right? Because, like I said, the notion that empiricism is the only valid means of acquiring knowledge cannot be proven empirically. It's something that is just presupposed.
I got it.
And then that leads us down, arguments like, and that leads us down the path of presuppositionalism, essentially.
Yeah, because, I guess, in other words, the imperialist approach is, like, based upon rational decision. but then like rationalism as opposed to like empiricism, like with the latter stating that like the only true thing like is what I can feel.
Because this and the thing is why this is so relevant is because this leads to scientism, that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Which is where you get those people with the "I fucking love science" shirts and Jackson, like that. They just they sort of have a dogmatic trust and even in faith, and they're trust to science, bro, trust to science. But
no, exactly. So I mean,
and from that criticism that can lead you to presuppositionalism and transcendental arguments and things like that. And which actually ties back to Platonism and sort of circles around. Because this is what was in Plato's third realm, right? This contrast with nominalism, these abstracts or these transcendentals.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you can't actually prove these concepts through empiricism. So there obviously has to be something beyond that, And that's why...
exactly.
I actually am writing one of the essays, because this book I mentioned, the book that I'm writing, it's basically a collection of essays. And in one of the essays, I infused these philosophical concepts that we've been talking about with some geopolitical analysis. And basically what I say is that, I expand on this in the essay, I say, we have this counter-hegemon, right? As Dugin would say, he talks about this in his books, like Foundations of Geopolitics. We live in basically a unipolar world, which is dominated by this U.S. or Western-led international order. But I see that there is this sort of counter-hegemon exists. Right, you have this alliance of nations like Russia, Iran, China, Syria, so on and so forth. And what sort of grounds them is that their ideologies, to a certain extent, are actually, when you look into the ruling ideologies, they're actually sort of grounded in perennialism. And these ideas that we've been discussing throughout the podcast, they all have this sense of traditionalism, right? Of devotion to some quality that's greater than just, the material world. These abstract notions like nation or fatherland, motherland, the ethnic units. In some cases, they infuse this with religion, right? Like we see with the Orthodox Church having quite a lot of political influence in Russia. But then you see perennialism manifesting in the real world geopolitics when you have Vladimir Putin saying multiple times, making public statements, saying that Orthodox Christianity and Islam are sort of natural compatriots or brothers. Now, I know that's a controversial view among theologians.
Yeah.
But that does sort of echo the perennialist philosophy. And then when you look at, the fact that Alexsandr Dugin...
Oh, yeah, like in his... sorry to interrupt again, but...
Oh, absolutely, go ahead, yes.
So on his Telegram, like he did say that, like Islam... like he did mention that, like, I guess with a lot of things he kind of likes to phrase them in kind of a not in a hysterical way, but kind of in a bombastic way. So he basically called what's it called? Like what's the word, like when you basically charge interest on a loan that you give out? Usury. Yes, that's it. So he basically called the usury on an absolute evil. But I think there is like a banking system. Yeah, there's a banking system called Islamic banking that got launched, and he was take like the end of the message that he sent out. He said that like Islamic banking in Russia is synonymous with Russian banking because like it does not permit usury. So I mean that's pretty similar to that comment.
Islamic banking just strongly condemns usury. I mean, I view it as actually a fair system, but you definitely see a commonality between these counter-hegemonic powers, in that they are sort of they do sort of follow these more spiritual perennialist ideals, right? And I think a good example of that is actually Iran. The 2020s kicked off with a bang, right? We had the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the respected Iranian general, who the U.S. media was labeling him as a terrorist, even though he actually played a key role in eliminating ISIS from Syria, because he led the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And he led many initiatives to wipe out ISIS. So I do think it's kind of ironic that they called him a terrorist. But after he was assassinated and we sort of entered this saber-rattling phase and tensions skyrocketed, everyone was talking about the possibility of World War III. And nuclear war. There were, threats made back and forth, and there was this notion, maybe Trump is going to bomb Iranian cultural sites, right? And then there was some foreign minister or Iranian politician or figure who I think posted made a tweet that went viral saying, well, see, the distinction here is you could bomb our cultural sites, yes, and they are very sacred to us, and that would be just a grave atrocity. But what if we retaliated and did the same thing to you? Well, then the thing is, what even are American cultural sites? This is what he said, right? You have McDonald's, Wall Street, these major corporations, and regardless of whether or not you agree with the idea that we have cultural sites in America, that was quite a prescient critique, and it definitely reflects the sort of spiritual and philosophical underpinnings of the ruling governments of these nations. Like, they view themselves as being bound to these ancient esoteric traditions, right? And the idea, and this anti-materialist philosophy, anti-corporate philosophy. So that's why all of these thinkers are just so relevant to the modern world. And they're especially relevant in geopolitics, right? Because we talked about Fukuyama, and he said, well, now the Cold War is over, and we're in this era of liberal democracy, we're not going to see conflicts. Well, what I write about in my essays during this upcoming book is that I basically envision modern-day geopolitics as being like a Cold War 2.0, except that the alliances have shifted somewhat, right? But we still see competing power blocks, to use the Duginist terminology, these Eurasian and Atlanticist powers, right? You have the Atlanticist powers, which would be basically US and EU, and they're kind of in this this conflict with the Eurasian or Eastern powers like Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, Syria. And so, it's ultimately this source of tension that I think would lead to a World War III. Like when you have a set of alliances.
I like the complete 360 that we did there with Fukuyama.
Yes, exactly. Oh, yeah. No, I completely disagree with Fukuyama about this. Like, a system of interlocking alliances, especially when it's so dualistic, right? Like this, and it's not even clear that there's much middle ground, it's a recipe for disaster, and it's a recipe for a world war.
There's so many dualistic dichotomies in modern politics. Like, as you said, using Dugin's terminology, Eurasianist versus Atlanticist powers, liberal versus conservative. There's so many, you only have two choices. And I feel like a system of two choices is, in many ways, even worse than a system with only one choice. Because a system with two choices gives you the illusion of choice without actually providing it. And I feel like that's a lot more unethical than just being upfront saying, hey, there's really only one path.
Oh yeah, I completely agree with that. Absolutely. But
yeah, and then subsequently, if you do have two choices, like in the United States, like for instance, I guess a lot of people are ultimately shocked by, the gay, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, we want something that is an antidote to that. Just like we saw in the 2016 elections, so they come to the Republican Party, but ultimately speaking, I don't think the Republican Party really challenges the status quo. In fact, it probably enforces it more than it challenges it. I'm talking about the boomer phenotype, free capitalist, beer drinking.
This boomer,
LGBT, liberty, guns, beer, Trump.
Exactly, yeah. The boomer conservatism is sort of dying out, to be honest. It's just not really popular.
Quite literally dying out.
If you look at the polls of Generation Z, I think overall they lean more to the left, more so than even millennials, but the members of Gen Z that do belong to the right have kind of rejected this, free market capitalist, boomer notion of conservatism, and they leaned in hard on identitarianism.
Part of Gen Z right wing is not going to go out supporting right conservatives anytime soon.
Exactly, which sort of ties into these dueling geopolitical power blocks. This conflict is just intensifying so much because obviously identitarian conservatism is a lot more radical and it's more of a violent opposition to the status quo and this kind of free market, capitalism, the LGBT, that concept that you mentioned earlier is. So it's interesting to see things unfold. And if you're going to talk about modern day geopolitics and, competing Eurasian versus Atlanticist powers, there have been so many interesting developments recently. I mean, everyone knows about the Russia-Ukraine war and how that just seems to keep intensifying. We had Prigozhin announced dead recently, but a lot has been happening in Africa recently, actually. We saw that there was a coup in Niger. Yeah, where this new ruler came to power, and he actually said that he plans to pretty much cut off diplomatic ties with U.S. and France. France was just colonized Nigeria in the 20th century. He plans to cut off diplomatic ties with those countries immediately and actually orient himself towards Russia. And then we actually saw that he invited Wagner PMC fighters to enter the country, and they started clashing with Al-Qaeda on the border with some other country. I forgot.
Completely realigning the country's foreign policy. That's crazy.
Yeah, it is. And then actually there were articles in Western media that I thought funny. I was going to post this on one of my social media platforms, but they actually labeled the Wagner fighters as terrorists, but the Al-Qaeda terrorists as fighters.
That's crazy.
Which I thought was quite interesting because, we can get into that, and I guess in a separate episode, but it's just obvious, this is just trying to demonize Russia. They're calling the Wagner fighters terrorists, but Al-Qaeda terrorist fighters. It just seems a little bit bizarre to me. I mean, it obviously shows the stance of Western media on this. It's a sort of selective reading of world politics. But why this is so important is because there's just no doubt in my mind that this is going to have some domino effect. There's another neighboring African country, I think it was Burkina Faso, where there were actually massive protests in Burkina Faso where people were demanding that Russia, and more specifically Wagner, enter the country to liberate them from their status as what Dugin would call an Atlanticist colony. He refers to Ukraine in the same terminology. And they were waving Russian flags, and these sub-Saharan African countries just got swept with a wave of pro-Russian sentiment. And so obviously I think it's quite frightening for the West, especially because a lot of Western policymakers and analysts say that Africa is kind of the future, but it's booming, youth populations and some rising economies like, South Africa, which is now part of BRICS. They think Africa's the future.
We went entirely into the realm of politics, but I think the pattern that we saw with China will continue in Africa. Like, if I were to make a prediction, the situation was that a lot of things were being manufactured in China, therefore the term made in China, but China slowly started buying out factories in Africa. So now things have moved on.
Exactly.
China has become a superpower. You no longer manufacture things. African nations, particularly like sub-Saharan African nations, now manufacture things for China because they have a higher population, a higher workforce, and they don't need to be paid as much. And slowly we're going to see the same pattern that emerged with China in Africa. Some African nations are going to adopt pro-Chinese policies as a result, and they will go the same way as China did, slowly becoming more influential on the world stage because they are no longer manufacturing powers. Then we'll see manufacturing powers move slowly to the other less developed countries, maybe even parts of the Balkans or South America, the countries that are left and still have low-paying workers, probably even Central America, as we see with Nicaragua and Guatemala. They still have very high poverty rates. And over time, you'll see like these nations sort of stable out, and we'll likely see a couple of outliers as a result. There'll be outlier African nations that will not comply with this policy, and they'll go in a completely opposite direction. So with nations like Niger taking this stance where they're aligning themselves with Russia, you're seeing an example of a foreign policy that we'll see whether it will work or won't work within the next few decades.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's quite interesting that Russia and China are simultaneously trying to expand their sphere of influence to these sub-Saharan African countries. I mean, it's got to be an absolute nightmare for the West.
Seeing as you went from Neoplatonist philosophy directly into geopolitics, are there some final thoughts on philosophy that we should wrap up?
That's true.
During the podcast.
I mean, we've been going for about at least an hour. I think like an hour and 30 minutes. It might just be time to wrap up.
Oh yeah. I was actually thinking of doing this a little bit before here, but I'm interested in giving kind of a more like thorough etymological analysis of the word philosophy, like what it meant before, and like I guess the history of philosophy and kind of how it became like secularized really as time went on. So I think Pythagoras is actually credited with inventing the word philosophy. Like if you analyze the ancient Greek word, so philosophia, like it comes from the fusion of philos, which means love, and sophia, which means wisdom. So I mean, like, quite literally, in like most reduced. Well, I want to say reduced, but like in its most original sense, it means love of wisdom. But obviously, like modern day philosophers don't necessarily go after wisdom, as like we see. A lot of like them, I guess, it could be labeled as like mental gymnasts. Like they perform like mental gymnastics, like invent a bunch of like mental notions, or just like a lot of like quote unquote philosophical notions that, like I don't know, just basically like hold their to like not lose their tenure at a philosophy department. So actually, I have this author. I have a few books by this author called Algis Uždavinys. He's a Lithuanian author, and one of the key points that like he wished to emphasize in his books is really like the complete semantic like flipping that the word philosophy underwent. Like philosophy for Platonism in general is actually a sacred word. So if you read the work of Plato and Plotinus, and when they use the word philosophy, they don't use it as just thinker. They use it as someone that like goes after wisdom, goes after the ideal world, as you say, like the ideal realm. Like in his treatise on the virtues, Plotinus actually talks on like three kinds of people that are set like to follow the well, not to follow, but like to reach the ideal realm. So one of them is the musician, the other one is like the quote unquote lover, and the third is the philosopher. But then like obviously he doesn't use like philosopher in like in secular or materialist sense, but
Yes.
Rather someone that actually goes after like divine wisdom, like Gnosis, as I mentioned.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, like that word, like philosophy, ultimately has a sacred root, like so to speak, because I mean, it's ultimately it's probably more synonymous like with mystic or like even ascetic than it is like with the word thinker, like for the Platonic thinkers. For like in the dialogue Phaedo, Plato always discusses like the philosopher as someone that is indifferent to the pleasures of the body, like in Platonism, epithumia, basically like the lusts of the body. Someone that's interested in like basically pursuit of truth,
Yes.
pursuit of actual knowledge, like gnosis really, and spiritual development ultimately. So
yeah. Sorry to
I mean,
interject, but I think of the quote by Evola where he says, "Neither pain nor pleasure should enter as motives when considering what must be done." It's just something like that.
Yes,
I'm paraphrasing.
banger quote. I put that on my website.
Exactly, yeah. It's just such a relevant quote to what you're talking about. And it's interesting
actually,
because when you go to the 20th century, you see a lot of radical changes in philosophy, postmodernism, the post-structuralists, and it seems like they pretty much completely abandoned those principles and let themselves be conquered by, these hedonistic pleasures. Like, look at people like Michel Foucault, for example, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I know Jakub. I think you're not really a fan of Foucault and thinkers like that. You're expressing some anger towards
some contradictions with Foucault. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess in our circles, he's a pretty unpopular thinker. I think there's some value to be had in his work, like the concept of the heterotopia and these sort of countercultural spaces. Has influenced me. I view him more so as a sociologist and like a cultural critic than someone with a lot of valuable contributions to philosophy. I mean, his work on the relationship between power and knowledge, I think, is pretty interesting. But he was, his entire life was just basically what we would probably describe as degeneracy and, the sort of vulgar hedonism. He let himself be a slave to his mortal passions, with drug use and these massive orgies and he's not alone. When you look at 20th century sort of continental philosophy among the French philosophers, right? Many of them succumb to these pleasures.
Exactly.
That moves away from the conception of what a philosopher was in ancient philosophy.
Yeah, exactly.
And Dugin himself, like he said, he thinks that the West's sort of rejection of Platonism, especially in Platonist metaphysics, is just a tragedy. As I brought up earlier.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, personally, I don't necessarily think Dugin is. I didn't usually. Pardon?
Oh, I was just gonna say, we've covered a lot of ground and we've been going for a while. I think it might be time to wrap this up. But what I'll say is that I think.
Sorry, just one more thing. So, I still didn't address that question. How compatible is Christianity with Platonism? Because I got, I guess, a little bit too wrapped up in what Neoplatonism actually was.
Yes.
So, I think ultimately, there was a lot of influence of Neoplatonism on Christianity. So, Saint Augustine, Saint and Pseudo Dionysius, both are Christian thinkers with a lot of Neoplatonic influence on them.
Yeah.
I wouldn't. I think it is ultimately compatible to a fairly large extent, but I think ultimately Christianity, because of emphasis on the Old Testament, Yahweh. So in other words, the Yahweh of the Jewish Bible, being basically subject to being, because there are a lot of there are parts of the Bible where he is shown as where he shows his wrath, both in the Old and New Testament. I think ultimately Neoplatonism focuses more on something that, or on principles that are outside or beyond, rather, of time. But ultimately, there are Christian philosophers that do focus on God that is beyond time, as well. So Meister Eckhart, for instance, I think he's fairly known among modern day spiritual seekers, so to speak. He was a German friar / mystic / philosopher during the medieval times, and I think he wasn't directly influenced by Neoplatonism, but I think he might have had a lot of spiritual experiences that are very similar to that, basically that tie into the notion of God as being and.
If you look at the relationship between Neoplatonism and Christianity, I see many commonalities between Neoplatonism.
And particularly Eastern Orthodoxy as well.
Yeah, no, I was actually going to say I see many commonalities between Neoplatonism and the early Orthodox Church fathers. And isn't it interesting that we were talking about geopolitics? Well, Russia's a majority Orthodox country with where the Orthodox Church possesses quite a lot of influence, but also interestingly enough, Syria, while it's not an Orthodox majority country, it's actually home to the oldest church on earth, the Syriac Orthodox Church, and they still, if you want to talk about ancient beliefs and tradition, well, they conduct their rites in basically Neo-Aramaic, and which actually predated, I believe, Latin. And Saint John of Damascus. Well, it's in the name Damascus. He's probably one of the most influential of the early church fathers in Orthodox Christianity. And so, isn't it interesting that Russia and Syria and these countries and also Serbia is sort of leaning themselves in this towards this geopolitical direction. Mm-hmm. All have this.
Well, Serbia is basically
Orthodox nation, right? It's quite interesting to think about when you think of geopolitics. But I think we've covered so much ground in this podcast that it's probably time to wrap it up. But I definitely in future episodes, I think we could definitely touch on geopolitics, right? It's just so relevant, and it's a little bit, maybe it might be perceived as a little bit more pragmatic, but we can definitely talk about, Dugin's thought, Eurasianism, foundations of geopolitics, these recent developments. I definitely like to go into some recent events in the Middle East, because we might actually be seeing a sort of resurgence of jihadism and groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and anti-Israeli sentiment as well. Recently, the leader of Palestinian Islamic Jihad actually called for a third intifada against Israel. It's all quite interesting. I think we should touch on subjects like that in a future episode, but we covered a lot of ground, and it was quite a successful podcast, I'd say. So I'll hand it to you, Jacob, to wrap it up.
Yeah, so to end it off, we are planning to go in a more chronological order, but I think, per my first suggestion prior to starting this podcast, jumping around topics and connecting these concepts to one another, in the terms of how we did with Foucault and Evola and Neoplatonist thought and geopolitics, I think we've done that somewhat successfully. I'd like to thank FlyingCabala and Murad or Jordan for participating again. If you want to support Jordan's content, you can go to Jordan's archives, which is linked to the Scorpion movement. And I also want to thank all the viewers who actually took the time to listen to us talk about these various topics, and I hope that they got something out of this. We'll be making future episodes shortly if these do successfully, and please do let us know what you would like to hear in future episodes. In the description, I will most certainly put the links to the Telegram channel and Discord community, which you can join and participate more broadly in these discussions. So thank you guys again for joining us. Thank you, FlyingCabala, and thank you, Jordan.
Yeah, thank you a lot, Jacob, for having me on. Thank you a lot, Jordan. Also for having me on. Thank you both for your participation. I really enjoyed this conversation. I mean, I think we really touched some deep concepts, we're basically analyzing just several spiritual traditions and I guess the status quo, geopolitics, stuff like that. I mean, I think it's really interesting, and certainly
same sentiment on my part.